Of the 12 days of Ridvan, 3 are holy days. And today we're going to honor and celebrate the 9th day of Ridvan. The 3 that are holy days are the first day, the 9th, and the 12th. On the first day, Baha'u'llah arrived in the garden after crossing the river, and then the river flooded, and so no one else could pass across the river. And so he then had the privacy, if you will, with his sons to reveal himself as the manifestation of God. But then the waters receded, and on the 9th day, his family was able to join him. And I know Nabil came upon that occasion as well. And so that's also the holy day we're recognizing with this video. And he then announced and continued to announce his declaration of this new day. And then on the 12th, of course, he departed from the garden in the garden of Ridvan in the majesty of the manifestation of God. So today, the tablet we're going to look at in Days of Remembrance, it's tablet 17, although there are 4 tablets in a row, 17 through 20, about the 9th day. 18 through 20 are a page or less long, and they cover the same themes as the longer tablet 17. So we're going to focus on that particular tablet. Now, these tablets were revealed on the 9th day of Ridvan, but some 6 years later in Akka, when Baha'u'llah was in the most great prison. So now when he's leaving Baghdad, it's his 2nd exile. And by the time he gets to Akka in Israel, that will have been his 4th exile. Now, what's fascinating about this tablet number 17 is that Baha'u'llah redefines for us what hosting a holy day is. He redefines for us what hospitality is. And I think it's a good time today to ponder what exactly is a holy day, which we really haven't discussed at length with these videos. You know, in the Middle Ages, going back in time, nobody had holidays or vacations because they were working all the time. And if there was time taken off, it was a pilgrimage. It was a holy occasion. Hence the word holiday developed from the word holy day. And by the same token, the American word for holiday, vacation, comes from the Latin verb vacare, like the Spanish vacío, which means to empty. And so a vacation was a time for emptying oneself of the ego and all that pertains to the mundane in order to be filled with the presence of God. So that's what a vacation is. So, I mean, even when I was a child, as a Catholic, the 3rd commandment is thou shalt honor the Sabbath, and so 3rd commandment of Moses. And so I had to sit around in a starched shirt and tie and my dress shoes all day and not play. My father couldn't wash the car. All the stores in town, and this is New York City, were closed because this was how the Judeo-Christian society in America celebrated the Sabbath. But in many ways, I think, we might have been celebrating the form rather than the substance on many of these occasions, certainly when I was a child. But in any case, the main point to my understanding, as all these comments in these videos are, simply my understanding, that a holy day like Moses' Sabbath is a time to escape calendar time and to experience sacred space. So once again, it's about emptying ourselves to be filled with the sacred, with eternity, if you will. Now, we talked about that until 1863 in the Ridvan Garden, humanity did not reflect the image and likeness of God, as the book of Genesis says we were made in that image. We instead reflected the image of nature, because humans really defined themselves as physical and biological beings. We defined ourselves according to our gender, our race, our nationality. And although many of these fallacies of defining the human have been exploded in modern times, we're still plagued by the disease of nationalism. Many of us still congregate as if that's our identity. However, it seems as more and more as the earth becomes one country and mankind its citizens, that those biological and material ways of defining the human being are becoming more and more absurd and inadequate. So the Holy Day gives us this opportunity, as Walt Whitman might say, to loaf our soul. And I'll tell a story about Holy Days from my childhood. When I was 12 years old, the Dodgers and the Minnesota Twins were to be in the World Series. And Sandy Koufax, a great pitcher, one of the greatest of all time, and he's still alive, he's a wonderful human being. He was scheduled to start the first game. And the World Series back then was like the Super Bowl is today, back when baseball was the American national pastime. And so Sandy Koufax is an observant Jew, a very devout Jew. And so he never works on the holy days. And so even though this was the first game of the World Series, he was not going to play, even though he was the best pitcher on the team. So this would be equivalent to, let's say today, the Super Bowl falling on, a holy day, and Tom Brady deciding not to play in the Super Bowl. That was the equivalent in 1965 when Sandy Koufax did this. And it makes me wonder sometimes when we continue to work on a holy day, if whatever it is we have to do was more important. But I mention this because Sandy Koufax, I wrote to him. I was so impressed by what he had done as a 12-year-old that I wrote him a letter. And he wrote back to me, and he sent me not just a postcard of himself, but he signed it. And you can see with the shiny signature that it's a ballpoint pen, and mailed it to me. This was back before autographs were monetized and things were done, autographs were collected because you loved and admired someone. But this is the kind of man who took off from work on his holy day. Often we rationalize, I have to work or I have to go to school because it's such an important blah, blah, blah. But that's the mind born of calendar time that's putting forth that argument. It's the mind that actually needs to be given a holiday, to be given a holy day. It's the mind that's always projecting our own fears and desires onto the world. And, as opposed to, I call it the selfie of the mind. We're projecting ourself into the midst of everything. And the time for a holy day is really the time to stop projecting the I, me, mine onto the world. In fact, Abdu'l-Baha said that in the future, those three words, I, me, mine, will be considered profanities. In any case, as Thoreau said, how can I waste time without injuring eternity? And I think if we waste a holy day, we are not only wasting time, but we are injuring holy day. So, this video is a little bit longer than the others because since it is a holy day and we're not working, we have more time. But now for tablet number 17. As I said, this tablet was revealed on the 9th day of Ridvan, either in 1869 or in 1870, because those were the only two Ridvans Baha'u'llah spent in the most great prison. And the theme of it is how to convert separation into nearness, into reunion, which we can certainly relate to in these days of physical distancing. In all four of these tablets, remember I mentioned from 17 to 20 in Days of Remembrance, they're all revealed on the 9th day of Ridvan in the most great prison. And Baha'u'llah is being invited to leave his cell. So we'll read the sentence but first let me just read in paragraph 1 what Baha'u'llah is praising. He's being invited by one of the believers to come into another cell of this stinking prison, this dungeon, to celebrate the holy day, the 9th day of Ridvan. And so Baha'u'llah praises three things in the first paragraph. He praises the friends for having gathered together. So important is this concept of reunion, that their action of wanting to gather together, even in these foul conditions, when there was little to eat or drink. He praises that. And then he praises in paragraph 1 the splendor of the most excellent names that God has shed upon all who are in heaven on earth. So he's reminding us in this first paragraph, to my understanding, of the significance of this day. It's a day of reunion with our higher selves as well as with each other. It's a day when all the attributes of God was shed upon the world to be reflected by us. And, he says, it's the day when the ancient king ascended the throne of his mercy. We talked about how the celestial throne now is like kingdom on earth as it is in heaven, the throne being ascended by Baha'u'llah in the Ridvan garden. So there's this unity of gathering together that Baha'u'llah wants to honor with this tablet. And it reminds us of what Jesus said, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am present. And so he goes to this other room. And let's take a look at paragraph 2. It begins off by, he says, this is the 9th day of Ridvan, O my God. And on this day, one of the loved ones hath invited him, who is the manifestation, to leave his room in the prison for another room. And Baha'u'llah now says that this believer hath spread before thy presence such of thy gifts as he had been able to provide. So this Baha'i in his cell is trying to provide some meager refreshments with their meager means in order to honor this 9th day. And Baha'u'llah says, this believer is doing this even though the people had plundered all his possessions and the possessions of others among thy loved ones. But since thou hast gathered them around thee, he asks that their hearts also be bound together in such wise that no differences may arise in their midst. So Baha'u'llah is honoring this physical reunion. He's leaving his cell to go to that other gathering, but he's raising it to a higher reunion, that our hearts be bound together in unity. And he returns to this theme in the next paragraph. But meantime, in paragraph 3, he comes back to this theme that we discussed about the nightingales circling the rose and the moth circling the flame. He says in the first sentence of paragraph 3, thou well knowest, O Lord, that it hath been the desire of all that circle round thee to receive thee during thy days of Ridvan. So great is this enjoining upon us to gather on Ridvan and celebrate reunion, that he's reiterating the importance of coming together, not just physically, but with our hearts. And then there's some touching kind of historical moment details. He refers to this wine from China. It's a poetic way, a beautiful way of referring to tea, being served in these white vessels. And this is probably the extent of the refreshments. But he makes reference to that. More importantly, he makes reference to what has drawn them together. He says halfway down in paragraph 3 that it's thy word that has drawn thy servants unto the heaven of thy loving kindness. So once again, we're back to this he refers to it as the lodestar, the word of God. And a lodestar is a magnet. So it's this word of God that he has revealed with this new potency on Ridvan that has the ability to attract, to cause reunion. And if we, of course, associate with the word of God, then we will be able to experience and also help cause this attraction. But he talks about 2 kinds of believers. Remember, the theme of this tablet, to my understanding, is the theme of separation and reunion. So he talks about 2 classes of believers, a few who have been enabled to attain this honor of gathering together. And so then he asks God to accept from them all that they have accomplished in thy path. But others have been prevented therefrom. So Baha'is who had actually walked from Iran 500 miles to see Baha'u'llah, they're being prevented from coming to the prison. No Baha'is in the area can come and see Baha'u'llah. And so he asked God for them the recompense of whatsoever they had purpose to accomplish. So once again, he's elevating beyond the physical to the spiritual. Their purity of intent to want to attain his nearness is being recognized as having been attained, even though physically they're remote. Once again, this is like the coming together physically has to be supplemented by the binding together of the hearts. And to emphasize this theme and the importance of that purity of intention, he mentions what negates reunion. The bottom of paragraph 3, he says, "O Lord, help certain souls to know their own selves and to restrain their tongues, lest they utter that which would abase their stations and bring their works to naught." So as he told us in the Tablet of the True Seeker that the fire of the tongue can last for eternity, whereas material fire just lasts for a moment. And so he seems to be identifying one of the biggest causes of separation. Apparently it's not the coronavirus, it's gossip. Now the next two paragraphs emphasize Baha'u'llah's sorrow over this separation of the friends that cannot attain his presence. That's paragraphs 4 and 5. And paragraph 7, Baha'u'llah says, if you were to squeeze this tablet, blood would come from it. He says in paragraph 7, were any man of insight to press upon this holy tablet, he would see the blood of my heart flowing from it, a blood that hath melted for the love of thee and of those who have been hindered from beholding thy face, after having directed their steps towards thee, and having come to abide within the city or its precincts. So it's that separation from God and this physical separation of the friends. It's causing his hearts to believe. And I think of that image in Catholicism of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. It's such a popular and adored icon. And we get here the heart of Baha'u'llah. And we're going to come back to this in the course of this discussion of the pain Baha'u'llah is feeling through his powers of empathy and sympathy and mercy. Now and of course we know from the hidden words where Baha'u'llah says that reunion is life and separation is death. And of course we know that from the biological world where the cohesion of atoms is what gives life and death is the disintegration. But as begins paragraph 8, Baha'u'llah has no complaint about these trials and ordeals, because he says he knows they're according to the inscrutable wisdom of God. Now, inscrutable is a word that I believe means something unable to be understood or comprehended or grasped. And so even when we don't know what the reason for certain sufferings happen, Baha'u'llah is showing us how he's able to not complain, but to accept this suffering. And now he comes to his definition of true hospitality. Halfway down paragraph 8, praying to God, he says, "Oh my God, graciously enable my loved ones to show their hospitality unto thee through their character and their conduct." So this is pretty fascinating. Hospitality is not by showing how many refreshments we can put out or how fancy the home is or the gathering place. It's about the character and the conduct of the host or hostess or the friends. And once again, we're back to that theme of form versus substance on a holy day. For example, we could take the day off on a holy day and have the form of it, but if we're spending that day using that time to not fill ourselves with God. And so Baha'u'llah points out, and I'm going to cross-reference this to a tablet we didn't discuss, which is tablet number 11, and it's paragraph 13 of tablet 11. One paragraph he says specifically about the form versus the content of Ridvan. He says in tablet 11, paragraph 13, he prays, I beg, O my God, not to number these thy servants with those who outwardly observe the festivals associated with the advent of thy manifestation, who honor and glorify these days as beseemeth their means and abilities, and yet remain shut out as by a veil from the one who is, through his command, the author of these observances. For thus will all their works be rendered vain, just like the works of the gossiper he mentions will be rendered vain. And as we know from the Nowruz prayer, when Baha'u'llah says that it could very well be that someone who has observed the outward form of the fast has broken it, but someone who has physically eaten and broken the fast, it has been considered as if he had kept the fast from all eternity. So there's something about the purity of intention, the inner meaning of reunion, the inner meaning of nearness to God, the content and substance of how we observe a holy day that transcends the physical. So here we are in this stinking dungeon, and yet there's this beautiful reunion. So it's the character and the conduct that is how we show hospitality towards God. And he says in this paragraph that that's what we spread out as the festal board. This is the bread of life, our character and conduct, and not the show of refreshment, so to speak. There's a quote by the House of Justice in Century of Light that I'm given recollection of in this theme. They mention about these times we live in today, in which they say it's a culture of coarse and intrusive communication that has become so commonplace in present-day society as to pass almost unnoticed. And so, in my opinion, I think with these holy days, we're trying to escape this culture of coarse and intrusive communication and to try to loaf our soul, to try to engage with that eternity, with those attributes of God. And so it's hard sometimes. How do we find the happy mean between the informality and the formality of a holy day? Because we know there are no rituals in the Baha'i faith. And yet it seems to me that ceremony is essential. That the hyper-informality, where we just sort of very casually pass a prayer book around, or the hyper-formality where we line up in a certain way because it's been done that way for generations. So how can we breathe new life? How can we breathe substance into the form of our holy days? And that's the open question, something for us all to experiment. And now for a story. I mentioned that this holy day, this tablet, was written on the 9th day of Ridvan. So it was written on either April 28th, 1869 or April 28th, 1870, because those were the only 2 9th days of Ridvans that Baha'u'llah was in the most great prison. Now, if it was written, well, let me just say this. Who I want to talk about right now is the son of Baha'u'llah, whom we don't often read about. Mirza Mihdi was the younger brother of Abdul-Baha, full brother. He was born in 1848, and when Baha'u'llah was exiled in 1852, he was only 3 years old. And it was the midst of winter when Baha'u'llah's family was exiled to Baghdad in 1853. And so he was too young to brave traveling over the mountains without winter provisions in the snow. In fact, Abdul-Baha suffered frostbite for the rest of his life. He was 8 years old at the time from that journey. And so for 7 years, Mirza Mihdi stayed in Tehran with relatives. And it wasn't until 1860 that he came to Baghdad to be reunited with Baha'u'llah, and then proceeded to, he was 20 years old at that time, and then proceeded to accompanied Baha'u'llah on his next 3 exiles until they came to Akka in 1868 when he was 20 years old. Now we're told that he was incredibly devout by one of the chroniclers of the believers who were in the prison, and that he was a pillar of strength to the other Baha'is. That is, he was so steadfast. And he served at times as an amanuensis to Baha'u'llah, as a secretary. Now, on this one particular evening, in June of 1870, Baha'u'llah told his son, who's 22 now, that he wasn't needed right now for any writing. And so Mirza Mihdi, as was his wont, went up on the roof of the prison for his devotions. He often would pace the roof during the sunset hour, communing with God. And he had 7 pebbles in his pocket because this was his rosary, so to speak. And he usually counted his steps because there was a skylight, and he knew how many steps it took to get to the skylight. But on this evening in June of 1870, he was so enraptured in his prayers that he plunged through the skylight onto a wooden crate below that pierced him. It made such a loud crash, his fall, that all the Baha'is came running. Baha'u'llah even came out of his cell. And the Baha'is carried his bloody body to another cell. His clothes had to be cut off him because there was so much blood. Meanwhile, Abdu'l-Baha prostrated himself at the feet of Baha'u'llah, begging him to save the life of his younger brother. So Baha'u'llah went into the room where Mirza Mihdi was laid, bleeding, his body pierced, and he asked everyone else to leave. So Baha'u'llah was alone with Mirza Mihdi. And he said to him, "Tell me, what do you wish?" Now, as I say, if this was 1870, it's only 7 weeks since that 9th day of Ridvan tablet in which Baha'u'llah was bemoaning his separation from the friends, and their separation from him, more importantly. And so we're going to see with Mirza Mihdi's response how it's a response to the revelation. It's a selfless response to this condition of remoteness and separation. And he says to his father, "I wish the people of Baha to be able to attain your presence." And Baha'u'llah said, "And so it shall be. God will grant your wish." But then this chronicler says he could hear Baha'u'llah in his cell, lamenting, "Oh, Mihdi, Mihdi." Now, the Guardian tells us, Shoghi Effendi, that every dispensation, a great act of atonement is required in order to release the spiritual potentials of the dispensation. So of these great acts of atonement, we're told that this was Baha'u'llah's own sacrifice of his son. And Shoghi Effendi explains that it was on a par with Abraham's intended sacrifice of his son, on a par with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, that sacrifice, on a par with the martyrdom of the Imam Hussein on the plains of Karbala, and on a par with the martyrdom of the Bab. And that through this sacrifice, separation again was canceled for reunion. Baha'u'llah sacrificed his own son for us. He suffered separation from his son so that we could have reunion with our Lord. And what I mean by that is, Baha'u'llah revealed a very powerful visitation tablet for the purest branch, which is the title that Mirza Mihdi was known by. And the Guardian, in this highly significant prayer, revealed by Baha'u'llah in memory of his son, this is where he exalts his station on a par with that of Abraham, Jesus, and the Imam Hussein. But then Baha'u'llah says, "I have, O my Lord, offered up that which thou hast given me, that thy servants may be quickened, and all that dwell on earth be united." So this sacrifice, the Guardian tells us, release all the forces necessary to bring about the eventual unity of humanity. So our separation these days is indeed temporary. In fact, Mirza Mihdi is the reason why we can physically reunite on pilgrimage today with Baha'u'llah. But his sacrifice, the Guardian tells us, is also why one day we will unite not physically and merely biologically, as humanity has for thousands of years, but be united spiritually, beyond biology, finally, in the image and likeness